In the chapter titled The Soul and Nature, Sri Aurobindo has brought us to the crux of the problem of our existence. In our experience, we find ourselves in two aspects. There is the soul as if a center of consciousness that is aware, that has the sense of some great freedom and responsibility, and even a need to change its circumstances. And on the other side, there is nature, which is as if invading the soul and even trying to shape it, define it in her terms, reducing the sense of freedom to something which is almost illusory. And the whole problem of our existence is really in resolving the right relationship between these two. Sri Aurobindo now leads us through a series of experiences or philosophical positions that these experiences correspond to, which describe the possible relationships between soul and nature. And through these steps, he leads us to a highest liberating and satisfying relationship. In the first insight that he gives us is the recognition that our soul itself has two poises. There is the experience of the soul embedded in mind, and as long as it is in mind, it is vibrant, but also it is troubled, and it finds itself subject to nature. But when it moves to a higher position of the spirit, it finds itself to be tranquil, calm, and free. And just as there are two positions that the soul can experience, corresponding to each position, there are two relationships with nature. In the lower status of the soul, nature dominates. In the higher status of the soul is free and in fact is master of nature. And so the key to this larger solution is this double relationship which is simultaneously present. He describes in the paragraph we are now reading what happens when the soul is involved in mind and the nature of the subjugation that it suffers, and from that position what are all the possible means of freedom or escape. So he explains there something which we went in somewhat great detail last time, that as long as the soul is involved in mind and working through the normal phenomena of mind, sensations, emotions, receiving impacts from the world through these channels, it finds that almost all of its working is defined by these impulsions coming from outside, and the nature of the substance of the mind, which is not of its creation, but which is part of nature. So it comes to the conclusion that although it tries to overcome, tries to find freedom, It is nature secretly which already owns, possesses, and determines this soul. Because mind itself is a part of nature. And soul embedded in mind means it is now a puppet of nature. And the practical result is that there is an element of illusion. Because although it feels like it is free, in practice it is completely defined by the working of nature, and especially the nature which is outside your own little mind, life and body, which seems to have a very subtle but unavoidable influence on you. We may take this a step further beyond our discussion last time by looking at how our body is formed out of the substance of the earth. Body is made of the material that you eat, which is itself material of the earth, the soil. If we had grown up in water, our body substance would be of a different character, because it would draw substantiality from the water, as you see in fish. If our body had been living in a different grade or type of substance, gaseous or other kinds of physical substance, it would have the character of that substance. Now, however much you may imagine yourself to be free, thinking, conscious, and exercising your freedom, the fact is everything you do is determined by this substantiality of your body and mind, which is formed out of the material where you are living in. And there is no way to avoid that. So is this freedom really true, or is it an illusion? And the tendency, he points, is there is an element of illusion because you never really are able to experience or exercise a total freedom. The saving grace, though, is, he says, there is a constant knowledge in the soul that, first of all, that it exists. It's a very interesting observation that we make when we begin to introspect on the nature of reality. You must have all seen the movie called The Matrix, where the central idea of the movie is that all the human beings are plugged into a gigantic computer, and through this connection on the spinal cord, the computer feeds into the brain all the sensory experiences. So everything that you see, hear, taste, touch, smell is actually fed into your brain by this central computer, which has you living in a virtual world when actually you are sleeping in a body which is plugged into the computer. And the question we could ask, how do you know that you are not actually living in this matrix? Is there any way you can determine whether this world is actually real, or you are plugged into a computer and everything you experience is fake, illusory? In fact, increasingly you will find the latest theories of reality, even in modern physics, are tending towards this idea of illusoriness, and the conclusion they are coming to is that the entire world is like a simulation taking place in a computer. It has no essential reality of its own. But is there something in your experience which you could distinguish and say, no, this could not be a product of a simulation? Everything you see could be projected into you. Everything you hear could be projected. What is there which is not of these five senses? And the one thing you discover when you introspect is the sense that I am, that I exist. The center where I feel I am conscious, from where I watch and observe these things. And the fact that you have an experience of something like this, which is not a product of sensory inputs, that is your saving grace from the illusoriness of the whole experience. Otherwise, there would be no way to know whether it's real or not. The one thing you know for sure that is real is there is this awareness that is independent of all the things being fed into you, from wherever they may come. So this is what he points to here. If there were not this constant knowledge in it that it is, first, and second, that it exists in itself, meaning it is not body, life, but something other, which at least receives and accepts the cosmic experience. So we have the sense that we exist, and what we exist is not made of these things. And this is the saving grace. If not for this, we would have easily come to the conclusion that everything is some kind of simulation or illusion. And this holds in check that conclusion. And unfortunately, the conclusion that modern materialism has come to and the nihilistic Buddhism arrived is this, that the whole thing has this character of illusoriness. And then Sri Aurobindo points to other variations of philosophy, but you will see what he is describing is not only a philosophical position, but an actual experience that one can have. Why it is important to study these and why he takes trouble to describe each of these experiences is in the history of human evolution, of human spiritual evolution, there have been centuries dedicated to each of these experiences. There have been civilizations which have been formed by each of these possible relationships between soul and nature. The most modern, of course, is the modern materialism, which has come to this conclusion practically that the character of reality is a kind of a gigantic simulation or illusion. Nihilistic Buddhism, as we saw last time, has a very similar approach, which is why the rational, atheistic mind can easily accept the nihilistic Buddhism as something which is giving a deeper spiritual satisfaction. But now he points to the Sankhya, which takes a step deeper, and he says the Sankhyas, perceiving the dilemma, solved it by saying that the soul in fact only mirrors nature's determinations and itself determines nothing, is not the Lord. So this is another position taken philosophically, experientially, that what do you find? You find these inputs coming into you. Your eyes are feeding images, your ears are feeding sounds. Who's registering it? This center, which you feel to be yourself, can turn attention to listen more carefully, or turn attention to the sight and watch more carefully. Or it can be so obsessed with the sight that it forgets to or ceases to register the sounds or the touches. So quite clearly, the soul has some kind of choice in how much it accepts of the registration. Itself determines nothing. It cannot decide what is coming in, but it can choose to pay attention or not pay attention. So the soul has this ability to accept the reflection of these things on itself, and itself is never modified. But it can choose what it can reflect, but can, by refusing to mirror them, fall back into eternal immobility and peace. Now what if, listening to all these sounds and images, you say, well, I'm going to stop paying attention to the sounds, stop paying attention to the sensations of my body and skin, stop paying attention to the sights coming in. That part is easy, you close your eyes. But you can't close your ears so easily. Okay, you can plug your ears, go into a silent room. What about the skin sensations? Sensation of temperature. You're seated, the pressure on the skin of the resting of your arms or your hips on the chair. Somewhere there's always some input coming in. If nothing else, inside the body, my stomach is churning, or I feel queasy, or I feel pain somewhere. Somewhere there are always inputs. Can I withdraw from them all? And in the modern materialistic exploration of this relationship, one of the experiments they conceived was this. If you can somehow put the body in a condition in which no senses reach the brain, because they said no soul, so brain is your registering instrument. Somehow you put your body in a condition that no sensations reach. What will happen to the brain? The brain suddenly will find itself floating into some kind of emptiness. And then it will start thinking only about itself, focusing on itself, will it go mad? Or will it enter into some exalted spiritual experience? And that was the speculation. And in the 1960s, they actually entered this kind of experimentation in the term used, I think, is isolation chambers. So these were chambers, little pods made, in which they put salt water of the body temperature. And your body rested in the salt water. Effectively, you had no sensation of the skin. And the temperature was fully controlled, and the pod closed. No sound, no sight, no touch, no taste, no smell. What happens then? And the first scientist who entered the pot was preparing himself to go mad or to enter some crazy experience. In fact, it was not so bad. And they enjoyed it. It was profoundly liberating. And then they began to make it a part of a kind of a training system, even extending it to training for the military, to give de-stressing experiences. But they also found that in such states, some people spontaneously had what they call psychic experiences, parapsychological experiences, visions, or states of floating out of the body and things like that. And so there's a whole institute called the Monroe Institute, which is continuing to experiment in these spaces. But this corresponds to this basic idea that the soul observing has a choice to refuse to mirror, and then it tends to fall back into eternal immobility and peace. This was the position taken up by the Sankhyas. Now you must understand, each of these represents a whole civilization and a whole period of spiritual exploration in human history, in which we have all been. We may not remember now, but we have each of us been through these different positions, experienced perhaps lifetimes, exploring or living by the values which each of these positions brought. And that's why Sri Aurobindo takes pains to describe each of these, in a sense bringing forward the benefit of those experiences. But also later you will see, when he brings the whole discussion to its highest and most satisfying resolution, each of these positions will be as if a special facet, a special experience from that highest position. So this is the position of the Sankhya. You are capable of determining nothing. You are not Lord, you cannot control nature, but you can accept or refuse what mirrors into your consciousness. And if you refuse entirely, then you fall into immobility, peace, which can even become permanent, no sense of space or time bothering it. There are the other solutions, which arrive at the same practical conclusion. And the practical conclusion is that you can disengage and become free in immobility and peace in eternity. But the approach to this is different. The same practical conclusions, but from the other end, the spiritual. Remember, this conclusion came from the materialistic and the nihilistic Buddhism. You can approach the same position from top down and come to the same conclusion. And this is affirming nature as an illusion, or both the soul and nature as impermanent, and pointing us to a state beyond, in which their duality has no existence. So the first position, which is of certain schools of Vedanta, they declare that the whole experience of nature that you have is an illusory experience. Same conclusion as that. But from a spiritual position, they say there is in fact a higher poise, a higher reality, something permanent, spiritual, against which this nature is illusory. And when you thus withdraw, it is into that permanence that you withdraw. The other variation to it is both nature and soul are impermanent, and you can withdraw to something which is neither of these. And this you will find even in certain Vedantic traditions as well as Buddhist lineages. One particular example comes to mind, which was from a saint in in one of the Southeast Asian countries, where he went around preaching, healing people through the trauma of a great destructive period. And at some point he became the patron of the whole country in its reawakening. He was visiting the United States, and many of his followers there came for what was declared as his first public talk. Till then he had no lectures. He would just meet people, smile, bless, and move on. And he was going to give his first public talk. So all the scholars came expecting something extraordinary, and he sat at his desk with a salt shaker and a pepper shaker, white and black. And then he spoke just these words. He pointed to the white salt shaker and said, "Self." Pointed to the black, "Non-self." Then he picked up the two and exchanged them and said, "No self." And waited. And everybody waited for the next. And he just waited. And recognizing that people were expecting more, he said, "Okay." And people said, "Okay, so what?" Oh, they didn't get it. So again he takes white, self, no self, exchanges, non-self. Okay, that was his speech. Now it's actually profound. What he was stating was, you have the experience of that you exist, that there is something, someone. And then there is the thing which is not you. Both of these are equally inferior, illusory, false, whatever term you may use. In the way he spoke, so cryptic, symbolic, you didn't have to specify what. Neither of these has any superiority. Exchanging the two changes nothing. It causes you to transcend to a non-either of these. This is self, this is no self. Both are fixed, limited concepts. Both are bound in some idea of reality, but it is not reality. The transcendence of both is the non-self or no self. That is the reality. And that's all he taught. Very simple. Now, if you dwell upon the whole thing, there's a huge philosophy, whole teaching behind it, so simply stated with a salt shaker and a pepper shaker. Every time you sit for food and you look at those two things, you should remind yourself of it. But this is what he's pointing to here. In some of these traditions, both soul and nature are impermanent. And as impermanent, you can say this is bigger, this is smaller. Does it even matter? They're both impermanent. If you say a small wave or a big wave, center of the wave, perimeter of the wave, what difference does it make? It's finally changing wave. And so there is something beyond in which their duality has no existence. This image is also represented in the famous Chinese symbol of yin-yang. Again, as a symbol, it is so powerful, it can capture so many aspects of reality. And if you read any book which explains the symbol, it will always be slanted to one perspective. Oh, this is the masculine and feminine, this is the hot and cold, this is the whatever duality they speak of. Any duality is represented. But if you go back to the essential dualities, you will look at it as soul and nature, which is the most essential duality. And it shows each is bound in the other, both are equally impermanent. Their transcendence in the totality or beyond the totality is the reality. Or reality includes both of these as facets, but itself is none of these, whichever way you formulate it. So, both soul and nature is impermanent and pointing us to a state beyond, in which their duality has no existence. Now you can see how in this very brief description he has captured so many traditions. Each of these traditions has articulated these relationships in different ways. He does not bother to name them or their fine distinctions. At the core of them is this idea: either nature is illusion or both soul and nature are equally impermanent. Get to something higher, which is the spiritual, which is none of these. How do you get to that? To the state beyond? Either by the extinction of both in something permanent and ineffable, or at least by the exclusion of the active principle altogether. So there are two ways by which you can get to that beyond. In the first one, you have to somehow find a way to extinguish both and come to the permanent. So, self is a varying wave, non-self, no self is a varying wave, or soul and nature are varying. Get beyond that. What is permanent? What is behind? What supports? And you keep on moving to the permanence. Or, he says, at least by the exclusion of the active principle, make the soul quiet, make nature quiet, bring everything into calm until there is only an underlying stillness, unchanging, permanent. So the active part is extinguished to get to the permanence. In this case, there is no idea of something higher. It is only the stilling of it all, and the stilling is the reality. Now these, he says, all of these, again he's categorizing many cultures, many religions, many philosophies and practices, which we have all been through at some time or other. He says of them, though they do not satisfy humanity's larger hope and deep-seated impulse and aspiration, these are valid solutions as far as they go. And in this very phrasing, he throws you a hint. As far as they go. Meaning, if you take any of these philosophies and question why, you will come to some stage where you say, well, that's how it is. You cannot explain further. Even in the most common Mayavada and the most powerful teaching of Mayavada, Sri Aurobindo deals with it in his commentary on in the Life Divine. He says, if you go back to the whole question, you say, well, everything is Maya, everything is Maya. Where did this great power of Maya come? Which is so great that she can create an entire universe and a cosmos out of something which is not universe or cosmos. Where did this great power come? And is it acceptable to say that the greatest power of Brahman is a power of illusion or delusion? Is that all that it can create? And somewhere in the tail end of the whole chain of logic that is built up by these approaches, you come to a question which either cannot be resolved or which contradicts your very starting point. This is the beauty of reality. The reality is cast in such a way that your mind can chase and build up a chain, and each step will be so convincing, and therefore, but you hit something which you discover contradicted your starting point. Amazing. You cannot come to a complete explanation of reality which is bound in logic. And it forces you to recognize that reality is not created by a logical consciousness. It is not an intellectual mind which formed this reality. The thing which created it transcends logic. And therefore, although you can explain and observe and analyze things logically, you will always reach a point where logic fails. This idea is used in certain traditions. For example, in the Zen tradition, there is the concept of the koan. A statement which is made, which inherently contradicts itself, and in dwelling in that statement, your mind ends up entering in collision with itself, and as a result either breaks down or enters a stupor, silence or stillness, or breaks out beyond mind into a higher reality. And the idea is to meditate on that until this breakthrough happens. The point we come to is none of these approaches which are bound in some structure of logic ultimately can satisfy. They leave something missing. Although they satisfy you up to a point, they miss out the higher aspiration of humanity and the larger hope, deep-seated impulse, which is to fulfill, to realize, to create something which is worthwhile. To discard everything is okay if it makes logical sense, but it does not satisfy this aspiration. For, what is the reason they do not satisfy? For they arrive at an absolute in itself, or at the separate absolute of the soul. Even if they reject the many rapturous infinities of the absolute, which the true possession of nature by the soul in its divine existence offers to the eternal seeker in man. So first they arrive at an absolute up there, beyond soul, beyond nature, beyond change, some sense of permanence and an absolute of the permanence. But the absolute exists, and all of this is somehow not part of the absolute. And so what you are aiming at is dissatisfying because it does not accept these things which are part of your experience of reality. You call it illusion, you call it impermanent, but still you are rejecting it and therefore not satisfying your sense of purpose in it. Or they have the sense of arriving at an absolute of the soul. And all this becomes illusion, only your silent soul is the reality. But then, what about the illusion? It leaves it hanging. Again, no satisfaction. And then he points to something more profound. They in fact end up rejecting the many rapturous infinities of the absolute. Meaning that in this approach to the absolute, there are the absolute itself being one, infinite and transcending all, it also includes all. And the approach to the absolute involves, in the very movement of the liberation and ascent, experiences of rapture, of joy. And the character of that joy and rapture is infinite. And many different facets of those, all these are rejected. All of these could be available if we had the right relation between soul and nature. But in the very act of discarding these relations, you are ending up with a loss of something. I remember reading a very interesting experience of a Vedantic practitioner who became a disciple of a great Buddhist teacher of the Chan tradition from Taiwan, and he wrote of his experience in the meditation. He had at some stage in his practice gone deep enough that he had reached a poise not only of freedom from space and time, but he entered a state of blissfulness and remained immersed in that for hours. And the teacher recognized what had happened and afterwards came to him and said, "This is good, but you have to go beyond this also." And so in the next session, he went further. He said, "Don't get trapped by the bliss, it will keep you stuck." And he went further and entered a transcendence. He said he came out of it after 6 hours with no memory of what it was, but he knew it was something. The question would be asked, while this is true, one can transcend the bliss, is a transcendence that rejects the bliss acceptable? Or would you want the transcendence that includes the bliss, includes the world, includes all relativities as aspects of itself? And so this is the question which has to be dealt with. And if you do accept these things, what is their relationship to that transcendence, to that absolute, to that liberation? So all of this problem comes because we started with the relationship of the soul and nature as embedded in the mind. As long as the soul is bound in mind, life, body, it feels itself a product of nature, and these are the only possible relationships, and some form of escape the only solution. Now we look at the other side of the whole story. That is, the soul itself has a higher station where it can live in the spirit in which the relationship with nature is totally different. While here in mind the soul feels itself a product of nature, in the higher poise the soul finds itself free of nature and even master of nature. So this now becomes the next description. Even in this, there are many possible relationships with nature, and Sri Aurobindo explores these. Uplifted into the spirit, the soul is no longer subject to nature. It is above this mental activity. It may be above it in detachment and aloofness, udasina, this is one option of relationship, seated above and indifferent, or attracted by and lost in the absorbing peace or bliss of its undifferentiated, its concentrated spiritual experience of itself. Now this is the second option. In the first case, the sense of this consciousness free of nature is that it is above, detached, aloof. There is a mental activity happening, there is an emotional activity, there is a world, and all of these things are moving, and you are simply aloof, somehow detached. Everything is almost unreal, and it does not matter. You are indifferent to the whole experience. And it happens, it goes, it comes, that's all. The symbol given often in the traditions is of the screen on which the image is projected. The projector projects a light, moving light of the cinema on the screen, the wall, the curtain. The curtain itself is not concerned with what is being projected on it. Is the character here good or bad? Does it matter? It's just a piece of light, a combination of colors. Is the whale which is trapped going to be free one day? Does not matter. Is the cinema well made? Is it interesting? Is it boring? Doesn't matter. It's just patterns of light. What does it matter? So there is this utter sense of indifference in the detachment and aloofness. This is the first poise, and a person can stay in that, and if you are totally aloof, time can pass, nothing matters. Or there's a second option, which is the same consciousness could turn into itself, attracted by something more valuable, and losing itself in the absorbing peace or bliss of its undifferentiated, concentrated spiritual experience of itself. So the screen can say, well, none of this matters, the light can play, but I am. And what I am is peaceful, is peace, or is blissful, is bliss. And that is so much more interesting that it can stay immersed in that spiritual experience of itself. And again you will see these two descriptions describe different traditions of religions, philosophies. Each has held sway in different parts of the world at different times in human history. Most of us have been a part of one or other of these at some time or other. And these are ideals which have attracted humanity, for which humanity has struggled. The truth of that possible relationship has been explored, and then its limitation also realized. And so when you look back at the whole history of humanity, look at the whole earth, across all cultures and traditions going back many thousand years, it's as if in the spiritual awakening of humanity, every possible facet of experience was taken up at some time or other. Built up, developed, intensified, taken as far as it could, and when it hit a limit that the experience could not cross, gradually it subsides and the movement fades, or the experience and its value is as if spread out into humanity, and is there as a nourishing support for anybody who now chooses to enter those states. But somewhere inside, in the collective evolution, in the soul of humanity, if we may use that word, in the identity of human collective itself, there has been the satisfaction of that experience. And the human consciousness says, and now what? What more? Is there something more fulfilling, more satisfying, to its own deeper and more ancient aspiration to realize and to experience divinity in life itself? So this is what Sri Aurobindo now turns to. And logically, we must then transcend by complete renunciation of nature the cosmic existence. If you accept this position, what's the conclusion? Well, you have to get out of all cosmic existence, not conquer by divine and sovereign possession. What's the point of trying to conquer the light that is playing on the screen? Anyway, you are indifferent to it. But there is a possibility that one could conquer, but not if you start with this idea. And so now this opens to the next position available to the experience. And logically he says, but this spirit, the divine, is not only above nature, it is master of nature and cosmos. So that status of consciousness, what is its relation to nature? First of all, it is above. Nature itself is as if a product or an expression of that higher reality. So, and if nature is an expression of that reality, then there is also the fact that that reality is the cause and therefore master of all that happens with nature. You could say it threw out nature, and now nature is working by itself and it is not master. But logically, you see, in the very act of throwing out, everything that is in nature is an expression of itself. And being an expression of itself, it is in nature and therefore is master. It may choose to not exercise the mastery, but it still remains as master because nature is emerging out of itself and expressing itself. So this is now the truth of the relationship of that consciousness with nature. What happens then if the soul rises to this status of the spirit? The soul rising into its spiritual poise must at least be capable of the same mastery by its unity with the divine. And so here's the logical recognition that if the divine is master of nature, as you approach and merge with the divine consciousness, you will automatically begin to share in that mastery. Now the scope of this, which he will explore later in much greater detail, begins with first your own nature. As you grow in consciousness and rise above the mind, increasing more and more in a diviner consciousness, you discover not only that you are free of mind, you are no more product of thoughts or tendencies or limitations, but also that from that freedom you can actually will the mind to become quiet or to redirect its working or even to reshape and recast entirely its current habit and pattern of working. And everything else below follows with the same power. So at least be capable of the same mastery. But what's the idea of at least? Sri Aurobindo says at least because at most there is something even greater that is possible. What is greater in the experience? In the divine consciousness, there is the working, let's say the divine consciousness moving to manifest the universe, the energy that pours, nature in its higher working, lower working. The individual here is living in the mind, feeling itself a product of this working, which seems to be mechanical here. This individual is now rising in consciousness until it begins to align to the nature of the divine consciousness, the spirit. And as it rises, it recovers its freedom in that, shares in the freedom of the divine, but it has two other possibilities. One, it can go further into a transcendence. it can also bring that power of transcendence all the way into the individual. And so it can do something which this cosmic working cannot do. It is towards this that Sri Aurobindo points as the great destiny of human evolution and the whole point of this cosmos. Why are we here is a question which cannot be answered purely logically. Because logically you can always question, but what's the point of this, what's the point of that? It's only when you go up all the way that you realize the whole movement is an outburst of the bliss of the divine to experience itself in innumerable forms. But that alone would not be enough. Experiencing itself in innumerable forms, each of these forms can now bring into itself something which has not so far been in the cosmos. It can rise beyond the whole cosmic working to that transcendence and bring out of it something new which was never there before. And each one can thus bring about something completely new, and the extraordinary possibility of creation, of our individual participation in something which brings out new, blissful impossibilities into birth, and the sharing of all that in the play of bliss. This is the direction and the sense of purpose that we now begin to glimpse. The fulfillment of this is beyond anything which the cosmos alone could realize, beyond anything that an individual life within the cosmos could enjoy. It goes beyond both of these. So here we have a glimpse of something much more beautiful, and Sri Aurobindo does not speak of it immediately. He just says, at least it should be able to match this, but perhaps it can do more also. It must be capable of controlling its own nature, not only in calm or by forcing it to repose, but with a sovereign control of its play and activity. So one option, as you rise into a higher consciousness, you say, all right, I'm able to quiet my mind. I'm able to quiet my emotions. And as a result, I can control myself. You will see it is relatively easy to be in control, to choose freely to do what you do, as long as your nature is quiet. So you will see people who do not have much vitality, do not have very strong energies, are naturally more balanced, more calm, more detached, more equal, more spiritual as we understand it, but also more weak, less capable, more fragile. Those who have greater vitality, greater energy, greater possibilities struggle to control, restrain their greater power. And this is the practical problem. You can bring things into a calm, force it into a state of rest, but that's not enough. You want to be able to have the full power of expression freely. And this is where he uses this word, with a sovereign control of its play and activity. All the play of activity possible should be available to you with your full mastery over it. The most intense, the most violent expressions, if necessary, should be freely expressed from this status without you being bound to them. Now, practically it takes this form for us. When you have, for example, a deeper state of consciousness or a higher state as a result of an experience, and you are now trying to integrate it into your life, you'll find it easy to integrate as long as you are moving slowly, as long as you are doing gently things, as long as you remain in activities that do not demand a large push, energy or violent action. The moment you do something which requires force or rapid action, you very quickly lose that poise and you can no more link that action to the spirit. And it takes time, it takes a struggle to bring it all the way into the most extreme, the most intense activity necessary. So you will find innately almost all spiritual traditions tend to have this necessity for a kind of a quietism, for a calm, forcing things to become quiet. And necessarily, therefore, the followers who have very strong vitality will only participate halfway through because they can't do more, they can't quiet their vitality. But also, what they cannot quiet becomes now even a problem for this spiritual framework. Let me give an example. And I'm drawing here from an actual example from one of the monastic traditions in India, from whom I heard the story of what was happening within their community. It's an old tradition, very genuine, spiritually deeply grounded. And my friend there was narrating how the monks, being largely withdrawn from life, largely indifferent to what happens in society, being more quietistic, they found very quickly that when their properties owned by their monastic tradition, when the properties got into trouble, legal trouble, financial trouble, political activism, politicians want to grab your property, what do? You don't have in yourself the force, the violence, the skill, the cunning, worldly wise capacity to be able to counter that or defeat that. And then what would happen is some of their disciples who were in businesses, who had that, who were living those types of things, would come forward and say, well, we will help you. And happily the monks would say, all right, you go ahead, you do it. They would do it, they would solve the problem, but in the very act of solving the problem, they had now gained control over what was happening within the monastery. Because now they dictated terms. You have to do this so that we can solve this problem. You notice there's a pushback. Anything that your movement or that's your spiritual experience cannot include into itself will remain outside it and will from there become either an opposition or a point of contradiction. And this is a very important idea when you look at the long-term future of any spiritual movement. And this is the way Sri Aurobindo's approach distinguishes itself. Because his approach requires a complete mastery that includes everything. Nothing of life should be left out as incapable of being perfected or mastered by the spiritual consciousness. Anything that is left out would represent for you a weakness or an incompleteness and imperfection, and therefore potentially a cause for failure. This is the distinction Sri Aurobindo makes between an over-mental community, a community built on over-mental consciousness, and a supramental community. In an over-mental community, an aspect of the divine has been captured and expressed, however beautifully, however perfectly, but it's an aspect. Which means out there, outside the community, there are things in the cosmos which are not included. And anything which is not included eventually will enter into collision. And so an over-mental community inevitably will find itself needing to brace, protect and wall itself in to protect from those very things which it does not include and cannot deal with therefore. And the practical result would be two over-mental communities might end up being unable to unite, being unable to work together because of certain components which are excluded from the other. You cannot have complete unity, you cannot have perfect harmony from an over-mental consciousness because it represents a limit. Only a supramental consciousness which includes all possibilities, which can embrace and include anything, including that which attempts to contradict it, is a part of it already, unknowingly to that person or to that force. It is already included in the supramental. So it can say, all right, you want to attack me, fine, and it includes already the force attacking it and uses it to its own purpose because that is a part of it. Only such a power can actually embrace the entire cosmos and make for a perfect and complete spirituality that embraces and includes everything. And this word sovereign spirituality has this character here. The soul rising into its spiritual poise must at least be capable of the same mastery by its unity with the divine. It must be capable of controlling its own nature, not only in calm or by forcing it to repose, but with a sovereign control of its play and activity. It must be full master of everything in its nature, but as we will see later, everything in all nature eventually. Because you cannot say, my nature separate from all nature. Eventually that thing will creep in and pop up. In the lower poise, this is not possible because the soul acts through the mind, and the mind can only act individually and fragmentarily in a contented obedience or a struggling subjection to that universal nature through which the divine knowledge and divine will are worked out in the cosmos. But the spirit is in possession of knowledge and will, of which it is the source and cause and not a subject. So this, we come to a line and an idea now which gives us the bigger picture of what's happening. What is the problem of working through the mind and the solution of working from above the mind? As long as you are in the consciousness of spirit, or as you approach spirit, you have this possibility not only to be free, but also to acquire this sovereign control of the play, of the activity, of your energy, of your will, of your knowledge. But you now drop to the level of mind. What happens there? Here you cannot have that control. Why? He explains. The soul has to act through the mind. If you want to act in the physical world, you have to have a physical body. If you want to act in the domain of thought, well, you have to have substance of mind through which you act. And the moment you have entered substance of mind, or let's take the example of substance of body, you are immediately limited to what the body itself is made of. If your body is made of the tissue that it is, you cannot, for example, put your finger in boiling water. You cannot dip your hand in molten metal and expect to be able to lift it. Your hand will just dissolve, burn out. These are inherent limitations of the body tissue itself. If your physical body was made of titanium by some evolutionary process, potentially possible, everything is possible. Then your hand made of titanium evolved could dip into molten iron and pick it up and shape it, the way we pick up clay and shape it. But whatever would be the material, it would define the limitation of what you can be and what you can do. So the titanium hand, for example, would have much less sensitivity, much less plasticity, for example. So when the soul enters the lower poise, it has to act through the mind, and mind can only act individually and fragmentarily in a contented obedience or a struggling subjection to that universal nature. So the first thing you realize, the moment you're acting through mind, you are operating through a cut-out piece of mind, which you call your individual mind. So in the very first step, there is a cut, there's a limit, and you have to act through a limited piece of mind. The second thing you recognize is that this piece is part of a larger whole which controls it or defines it. And so you have to accept the influence of this larger, and there can be two kinds of influence: contented obedience or struggling subjection. In both cases, you are dependent on the larger nature. But in the first case, you obey happily. Well, my mind has been created out of universal mind to have a character which is sattvic. And I'm very happy with this sattvic character. And I don't need to struggle much. I have always beautiful thoughts, always high aspirations, and my spiritual life is pretty good. So, contented obedience. Who made your mind psychic? Well, sattvic, that larger nature. And you're obeying whatever it has defined you to be. But what about your mind's capacity to overcome, to fight, to struggle? The sattvic mind shrinks from it. It is so content in its limitation, it doesn't even realize that it has a limitation. And on the other side, you might have a more rajasic temperament of mind, again defined by this outer nature. It realizes, oh my God, I am bound, I am limited, I don't like it. I am going to push back at each step, I am going to struggle, fight, try to overcome, except how much can it overcome? So struggling but subject, struggling subjection. At the end of it, you're still dependent on, you're still slave of the larger working of nature, but you keep struggling. Now if you had a choice, do you want struggling subjection or would you prefer to have contented obedience? Well, the sattvic type will say, I would rather be contented. The rajasic type will say, I would rather fight and never give up. Which one you chose determines the larger tendency of your temperament. And sometimes we have both, one part here, one part there. But neither is satisfying because both are dependent on something else. Both are subject. Both have to obey. To what? To that universal nature through which the divine knowledge and the divine will are worked out in the cosmos. Now here's the interesting thing. You are subject to the universal nature, but universal nature is doing what? It is executing what the divine will and what the divine knowledge have decided to do. And here's an interesting idea. You are slave to something which is a universal working, but the universal working is expressing a divine will and divine knowledge. So if you did nothing, eventually the divine will and divine knowledge through universal nature will work in your individual nature and will lead you to do everything as the divine will wants, isn't it? Eventually. Which would be fine if the whole evolution was still a collective, universal, semi-mechanical, evolution. But the moment the individuality has awakened in evolution, I am conscious, soul now says, I have a responsibility. My responsibility is not just to be subject to the slow process of evolution. My responsibility is to do what I know is possible. And I know this higher thing is possible, I must do it now. There's no point knowing this higher thing is possible and then accepting, all right, it will happen after a million years and I will let myself be carried. The very fact of the awakening of the soul as a center of consciousness makes for you to be dissatisfied, to be subject, and makes for you to want to recover the freedom of what? Of the higher position of the soul, which is reflecting in your lower soul. And so this is the point here. The moment you are in the lower working, you are subject, you are dissatisfied, but you cannot be otherwise. You cannot overcome. If you can shift the center to the higher position, you will share directly in the power of the divine will and divine knowledge, which are currently working slowly through the universal nature. But it is the same power that you are going to connect to. And this is going to be the most important key to the liberation and to a satisfying answer. You see, what will happen is, in the individual awakening, we will have the same power that is working in the universe available to the individual. The same knowledge that is working in the universe available to the individual. And the same goal which the divine will and divine knowledge have in the universe now available to the individual as his goal. The difference though is now the individual can experience this which the universe is trying to do much more rapidly, much more freely, and have the individual satisfaction and at the same time fulfill the universal satisfaction. And you see how it leads to the most satisfying solution. But all this he will elaborate later, and he will show you the fine steps that we have to go through to bring about this perfect alignment. How do you put yourself in relation to that higher knowledge, higher will and its purpose in the ascent? How do you give up your sense of separate knowledge, separate will, separate purpose, and put it in relation to that until what you have is still yours and yet it's perfectly aligned to the universe? So that is going to be a discussion which we will come to only afterwards, but it's part of the same paragraph. But right now we have anticipated and we come back to the point he is at. There is this larger working against which you are now beginning to struggle. When you rise into spirit, you have now the greater freedom. But the spirit is in possession of knowledge and will, of which it is the source and cause, and not a subject. Therefore, in proportion as the soul assumes its divine or spiritual being, it assumes also control of the movements of its nature. So the key is here, the spirit is the source of the knowledge and the will. As you approach spirit, you gain the freedom of knowledge and will, at least on your nature, on your limited individuality to begin with. It becomes, in the ancient language, Swarat. Ancient language here is Sanskrit, and the word Swarat is from the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna explains that if you truly want to master your circumstances, become emperor, so to say, of the world, or of your domain at least, Samrat is the word used, then first you must acquire mastery over yourself, become Swarat. Now the Sanskrit language is very suggestive, so it's worth looking at the word, the sounds used. Samrat and Swarat. Sam is all-inclusive, everything. Wherever you hear the word Samma, it means everything included in an inclusive movement. Swa is separating to yourself, to your individuality, centering in yourself, not including everything. Rat is rulership, authority, which enjoys. So Samrat is the emperor because he includes everything in his rule, in his authority, in his enjoyment. Swarat is that which is ruler, enjoyer and authority over yourself. And Sri Krishna explains, in order to master your circumstances, you must first master yourself. And this is what he is coming to. It becomes, in the ancient language, Swarat. As you ascend in consciousness to spirit, it becomes Swarat. And he defines Swarat, free and a self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being. First you are free. Right now you're not free. Can you stop your thoughts? Can you change the direction of your thoughts? With struggle, with difficulty. So you can say you're free, but only partially free. You have to exercise your freedom against opposition. So, up to a point. Can you be free of all thought and rise above thought? Can you shape your thought freely to whatever it is you want? You'll find somewhere there's a limit, and in the very act of trying to master your thought, you find a part of your awareness rising beyond thought. And that's the only poise from which you can actually master the thinking. So the sense of freedom grows as you rise up, and self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being. Increasingly as you rise up, you find all the processes of your nature have their threads of control above. Like the puppet master. He is able to pull the threads and the limbs move below. The rationale of this is that the universe itself is built top-down. The very opposite of what modern science thought it to be. Modern science assumed that matter is the fundamental reality, not questioning where it came from. Well, it's there. And from matter, you have energy, out of energy, you have consciousness, and etc. It's all phenomenon piled up over matter. If this is true, then of course there's very little that is possible as you go up. On the other hand, the spiritual experience is that it is in the oneness of pure spirit that you have the root. And from there, the root divides into branches, branches into sub-branches, into leaves, into flowers bearing fruit. And the interesting thing about this is, you can cut all that you want of the tree. You can keep chopping as violently. What will you do? You'll only push back the forms to a higher level which you cannot access anymore. And from there it will grow right back. You can never cut the root. Because in the very act of approaching the root, you become one with it. And so you can never cut it. You can never have a sense of separation as you approach the root. All separation, all conflict, all violence of opposition is possible only in the play of the branches on the surface, in the lower domains. So what you see wonderfully is, as you go up, you discover greater harmony, but also greater knowledge, because it is essential knowledge which becomes the many here, and also greater power. A single movement there becomes all of these, or controls all of these below. So because the universe is built top down, as you grow upward, you become more free, and you become self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being. And now comes something even more. But also it increases in control over its environment, its world. This it can only do by universalizing itself. For it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. So now we come to something even more interesting. Not only you have control over yourself, I can choose which direction I think. Not only that, I can choose which direction my life stream will take. Before taking birth, I can decide this is the direction of the development which I want to have. Not only that, it can put an intention from there which will ripple out and become an inevitable outcome here, literally commanding freely the destiny of the individual's journey. But now you notice something else. Where is the borderline of your individuality? It's very difficult to define. We have the illusion that our body is the limit of our individuality, and it was okay up to a point to believe that. But the evidence today is you and what you are and what you do has enormous ripple effects. Even in your own life, it's not just your body, because you're plugged into so many things. Your mobile phone, for example, is holding large contents of your memory. Things which you're afraid of forgetting, you have plugged it in here, and it's outside your body. Through it, I can push a couple of buttons and switch on lights. The control of the light is actually a part of my body almost, or in the mobile phone, which I hold with my body. I don't have to move. And the lights can be on the other side of the world, and I can still control them. You know, there are people who actually do that. They are traveling, and then through the phone app, they look at what's happening at home. They can control the camera, they can switch on lights, they can switch on the water pump, control the temperature. I'm going to get home in 1 hour, let me push up the temperature or start the air conditioner. By the time I get home, it's all in place. Where is the home and the control of the home? Right here. It's as if my own body is extending beyond these gross physical tissue. The degree to which this joining is taking place increasingly with technology is such that we can no more define this as a limited boundary. The skill with which technology is able to plug in, we can, for example, the pilot of an airplane, still operating through force of muscles in the old planes, now moves into what is called fly-by-wire, where you move something lightly and there's a whole chain which the computer controls to move a heavy flap which would weigh half a ton which you could never have moved with your own hands force, as you used to be in the old small planes. But not only that, now you can actually shift it to not having to move your hand at all, to simply being able to, let's say, move your body, move your eyes, and the thing happens. Now when you find, for example, in the more extreme examples, a fighter pilot in a plane that moves so fast that if you make a sharp turn, the body experiences gravity 2 or 3 times the normal gravity. So they'll say it's a 2g turn, 3g turn, 3 times normal gravity. And if you turn hard enough, you may hit 4g, where you black out, because the blood drains towards your feet as you turn, and there is not enough blood in your brain. You black out, and then as the turn is finished, the blood rushes back and you come back to consciousness. Now in an environment which is so extreme, if I black out and my hand does not move properly, or my hand cannot move because the weight of the blood is like liquid iron, how do I move the joystick to control the plane? I cannot. What do you do in such a case? And so increasingly the technology is to connect the mind, well, the brain, to the machinery. And this is actually working today, where the pilot intends to lean without moving. It's like you feel yourself or imagine yourself tilting, and that is picked up through the brain waves, and the plane turns. Now you notice what happens here. How do you move your body? If I ask you to bend to one side, what do? There is the intention to bend, and then the body follows. The same thing is happening with the plane. I have an intention to bend, and the plane turns. You literally experience the plane and its movement as an extension of your physical body. It has become, for all practical purposes, an extension of your physical body. Now this is an extreme, a dramatic extreme perhaps, but actually this is what we are unconsciously doing even when you drive a car. When you're driving a car, you do not think of, do you have to turn 5 degrees for the car to turn exactly so much? There's a degree of continuity of consciousness developed through practice perhaps, that I'm having a conversation with my friend, I realize I have to turn, my hand turns, and everything happens the way I intend it at a semi-automatic, semi-conscious level, without my needing to have conscious intention ever. It is exactly the way I walk. When I walk, I don't worry about, is my foot taking enough pressure to keep the balance? It's happening semi-automatically. So what you have done is, the same skill which you have developed of your consciousness to control your body has extended to the car, has extended to the ship, has extended to the fighter plane. Where is the limit, potentially? You realize the sense of boundary is artificial. Increasingly, as you have control over your own body and your own mind, it has a ripple effect in everything that plugs into your body and your mind, even energetically. My friends, my circle of friends, my family, they are all in energetic connection with me. If I become unhappy and I become a sinkhole of depression, I tend to pull them down. If I become bright and cheerful and full of optimism, bursting with positive energy, I lift them up. Aren't they effectively an extension of my own emotional life? And just as they influence me, I influence them. We realize we are actually a web of interdependence. Less obvious on a purely physical level, more obvious on an emotional level, less obvious in a mental level, but much more powerfully on a mental level, because we do not feel directly the influence of thoughts as we feel the influence of emotions. But in fact, the thoughts have a far bigger influence. They go well beyond your immediate circle of emotional friends into the environment. A strong thought formation, and especially in a collective, can have massive influences. Mother speaks of how certain kinds of sticky thought forms actually jump not only through individuals, but can have the effect of rippling out and hitting a large number of individuals in one go. You may not be able to do that emotionally. It would take a a lot of emotional energy to be able to influence a large number of people. But in thought, there is no energetic requirement. The same thought can be replicated in 1,000,000 minds instantly, and you do not feel the burden. It's the nature of the thought substance. So in fact, the ripple effect is much larger. Now see this in the context of what we are discussing. As there is increased self-rule and freedom, control over your own life and being, but also it increases in control over its environment, its world. Now my world is that particular area where I have my interests, stretching out well beyond my little physical space or little house. That's my world. And this can be then further accentuated and developed, and he explains how. This it can only do by universalizing itself. For it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. So if you want to go beyond that into the rest of the world, then you have to align with this divine consciousness and its influence in the rest of the world. It has an action upon the world, and if you align to its action, then you are effectively a part of that, or it is working through you. For it is the divine and universal will that it must express in its action upon the world. So the question is this: what do you want to do with the world, in the world? I want to oppose everything that's happening. Well, then you will end up in opposing in a little small piece, the world will push back. I want to fulfill what the divine will is already working to realize. In that case, what you're trying to do is in perfect harmony with the divine will working in everything else, with the difference that within you as a conscious individual, it can now concentrate much more intensely and develop much more rapidly what it has to do more slowly and indirectly everywhere else. But there is perfect alignment with everything. And here's the interesting result. When you try to do this, which is in line with the divine will, all the other activities in the universe, which are also being led by the divine will, are found to be complementing and supporting your effort. The universe is no more opposing you, the universe is actually working with you already, or rather you are now working with it, or rather its cause, but now much more rapidly. Of course, in practice you will feel resistance when you move faster than the pace of the universal working. But the direction is still the same, and the power which works is much greater. So, this it can do by universalizing itself. So as you ascend into the spirit, you can choose to accept a larger, wider, universalizing movement, or you can remain in a narrow poise also, but then you will never meet fully or merge into the completeness of spirit. But as you rise and accept the larger movement, something important happens. It must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself, instead of being like the mind limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. So now the process is being shown to us, and there are many steps which we will explore next time. But in this first step, you see what he is teaching us. It must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself. As the consciousness rises, as it becomes more free, as it ascends, approaching spirit, one can consciously accept to feel the whole consciousness widening to include the universe in yourself. What happens to the sense of soul? Remember, soul is the sense of individuality, and as it rises, the individuality now begins to widen beyond its limits. Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting comment on this, because when you have the wideness initially, it's like at first you may feel overwhelmed, you may feel lost, and you may feel as if you are going to die or you will cease to exist because your narrow individuality is breaking up. So people wrote to Sri Aurobindo something like, I feel I'm going to lose myself, I'll die or I'll become unconscious. Sri Aurobindo says, no. Consciousness does not go away. It is the limits of consciousness which are being dissolved. So what you actually experience as your consciousness now suddenly is no more bound and widens out, immensity. It must first extend its consciousness. How far? Mother's observation. When you are capable of becoming conscious of the whole world at the same time, then you can become conscious of the divine. The wording is very precise. If you are capable of becoming conscious of the whole world at the same time, then you are capable of becoming conscious of the divine. Why? Because the divine is all-inclusive. To become conscious of the divine, you cannot approach in a piecemeal. You cannot know an ocean by going with a bowl and scooping out water. You'll only have a little scoop that you can know. To know ocean, you must become wide as ocean to be able to embrace it. And so in any awakening to the divine consciousness, there has to be this widening movement. If there is not, then you will catch a certain aspect, a power, a limited experience, and stay stuck with that, which is what happens in many of the religious practices or narrow forms of tradition. So this first movement of widening has to be made. How far? Extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself. It must include the whole universe. And then he contrasts this with what we are today. Instead of being, like the mind, limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. Now when Sri Aurobindo uses so many words, there's a very good reason for it. He's describing a series of layers of the experience of the mind's limitation. First layer of the experience is that you know your mind is limited by what? By the physical. The moment you've taken birth in the physical body, you start crying. From that free, wide consciousness, suddenly you've been compressed and bound into this dull, rigid material substance. And as if all the memory and all the freedom and all the joy and everything begins to become dulled down, densified, until it's gone. And so you start crying. What happened? Oh, yeah. And you can't express yourself. You can't even speak to say what happened. Because the brain is not formed. The machinery of the muscles is not organized, harmonized or developed. You can only go, wah. This first limiting shock often tends to define your individuality for the rest of your life. And if it was not circumstances pulling and pushing to force you to widen, you'd stay stuck with, oh, I am body. So this is the first level of the limitation of mental experiences, to be limited by the physical. I am body. And people who live in the body consciousness primarily are so distinctly bound here. My mind is this. As you break out of it a little bit, and evolution, life forces you, you have a second level of mind limitation, vital, limited by the vital. Wherever my energy can extend, wherever is my territory, wherever is my domain, my possession, my control, my authority. Now you will see in the way the society evolves from the crude physical man. The crude physical man is about grabbing to hold and define your unit of identity. The vital man comes and says, my body may be this, but my desire is that much bigger. I need a large piece of land. I need to control so many things, so many spaces. And your immediate extension of life force is your territory and your mental identity. So depending on your temperament, it may take a more physical form or even a more emotional form. These are my friends, these are the people I trust, not those whom I don't trust. My tribe, which is my emotional bond. From there, further step of the limitation of mind. These are larger limitations, but still, they are limitations. The sensational limit of the mind. How far is your sensational limit? I can only take in so much through my senses. Anything beyond that is too much. And this can go much wider in physical space, but it is ranged in the quality of the experience. Food, I can't take spicy food. Chili is too strong. I can't take sour. This is too sweet. You see, you've narrowed the sensational range. Within that band, you can have anything. But that's a larger boundary, so to say, but still a boundary of limits. And your mind is plugged into those sensory limits. If you speak to me of ideals and abstractions, it doesn't touch me. Tell me this is comfortable, tell me that is convenient, yes. In the sensory domain, my mind is now much more flexible. A further range beyond that, emotional. And in the emotional range, I don't see the way you see the world, but I empathize with you and I can understand that you suffer. Now already your emotional has taken well beyond. It's not the same as the vital. Vital was the dominance and sense of possession of your own energy. In the emotional, there are bonds of empathies or sympathies which can extend and be much more flexible and go beyond your senses. You enjoy the strong chili and spice, well, I will make it for you. I hate it, but I can make it for you. You see how it is able to go beyond his own little personal comfort. But the emotional bond can be quite complex, and it can create complex networks of interests in society. Above that is a much freer space of the intellectual boundary of mind. Still mind is limited, but the limits are much larger. In the intellectual boundary you can have, for example, as you saw in the famous statement of Voltaire, I believe, who says that I disagree with you, but I will fight to the end for your right to speak what you believe. Somehow for you to speak something which is contrary to what I believe or contrary to my interest is something, an ideal that I must fight for to protect. You see the internal contradiction of it from an emotional or vital level. The vital man would say, oh, if you oppose me, well, I have to finish you and subjugate you, bring you in alignment with my interest. Your interests are contrary to mine, even the emotions will not allow it. But the intellect can become so wide and universal that it can say, however much you may oppose me, I'm going to accept your right to oppose me and your right to be free to speak against me. You see how complex it can become, but how inclusive, and yet this is a mental boundary. And Sri Aurobindo is pointing to the limitation of the intellectual outlook also. So here I have a series of outlooks of limitation of mind. We'll reread the sentence. Instead of being like the mind limited by the physical, vital, sensational, emotional, intellectual outlook of the little divided personality. At the end of it all, common to all these is I and the not I. And the I is little compared to the not I. Now, how far can this go? You can include the whole earth, let's say. You are now emperor of the earth. And you say, everybody on earth is welcome. Everyone should be happy. Even if they oppose me, I'm emperor. Anyway, they can't bother me. So, but what is not I? What is beyond the earth? How big is that? Well, the whole universe. It's infinite. However big you may enlarge yourself, you still are small, limited, and overwhelmed by the infinity which is beyond. How do you get beyond this? It must first extend its consciousness and see the universe in itself, instead of being, like the mind, limited by all these things of the little divided personality. So the whole universe must be included, and it cannot be done by the mind. It has to be done by a level of awareness which is even higher or deeper than the mind. The mind can project itself up to a point, but it hits a limit. How do you conceive of the universe? There's a boundary always. But in the experience which rises above mind, you feel yourself infinite, and the universe itself feels almost small and included in that. This can only come by an ascent above mind, not in the mind. This being the first step by which we are able to now include our greater freedom into the action in the world. There are now further steps in which what you did with your awareness, you would do with your energies. And then you would do that with other aspects of your will, of your knowledge, of your sense of purpose, of mission of life. In each of these, you will layer by layer, step by step, align with that. The spirit, the divine, its wideness, its freedom, its energy, its knowledge, its will, its purpose. And so he will lead us like this, step by step, until you enter in complete harmony with that. And the result is your individual action is perfectly harmonized with the universal action. And the soul and nature have re-established a new balance. Your soul is now master of nature, not only your individual nature, but all universal nature. And from the mastery, from the poise of mastery, the soul is free, and nature is now a plastic instrument to express its freedom without limitation. You see how that relationship has changed, where earlier nature was binding the soul and you had at best an illusion of freedom. The whole status is now reversed. The soul is free, nature is its free expression. And this is the transition that is to be made. In this, you find the full satisfaction of all of the higher and deeper aspirations of humanity. But from this, as he will show us, there are, or even in attaining to this, there are multiple levels or facets of the stages in the relationship. And all those that we saw earlier as possibilities are as if secondary experiences within this larger liberation. And that becomes the theme of the next couple of pages, which we will take up for detailed study next time, and that will be after a gap of 1 month. And we will continue this on from 28th of December. We can pause here and take up any questions or comments. The picture he weaves is so complete. He's showing you the individual evolution, he's showing you the cosmic working and the divine will and knowledge working on the cosmos and working on the individual. And the picture is so complete, everything becomes simple, obvious. And in the whole process, he led you step by step, logically, to an experience which is transcending logic.
One question came to my mind. What about the psychic and all that?
Very important question. When Sri Aurobindo is using the word soul and nature, what is the soul that is being referred to? In our immediate experience, it is this sense of I, which Sri Aurobindo calls the surface soul or the desire soul or the false soul, because it's only made up of desires which are themselves not innately real. As this soul begins its journey to come into its own, it begins a process of introspection. It kind of discards the fluctuating desires to look for what it is essentially. It comes to a deeper poise of itself, which Sri Aurobindo calls the inner soul. And that's the part which we are conscious of within us that has all of the higher ideals. To make your life beautiful, to live by higher standards, to express beauty and bliss and beauty and harmony and love and all the good things. Innately to this inner soul, it is not a bundle of desire or reaction. Where the outer soul reacts and is driven by fluctuating desires, the inner soul clings to a basic core pattern of goodness and ideals. But it is limited and it can be confused or deceived. Behind that is the true soul or psychic being, of which this is the first reflection that we are able to reach. And when this part begins to dwell into the source of its deeper aspiration, when it seeks for the origin of that which it is seeking to realize, it begins to go closer to. And so there's a whole movement of interiorization inward, step by step, which progressively brings the surface soul in more and more direct contact with the true soul, or under its influence. And at some point the true soul can come forward and the surface soul merges or joins, and there is only the true soul. Now this process may take place first and then the movement of the ascent. Or generally what happens is, as you begin the movement of ascent, there are gradations of purification until this joining takes place with the psychic being. But eventually, the person who rises, the individuality that rises to this status of the spiritual consciousness, must become the psychic being. In the text itself, he does not make that distinction that is implied. He speaks of it more distinctly in certain earlier chapters, where this concept is clearly stated. But otherwise, what can happen is, some part of the mind's center of I can rise, but it can only go so far. It cannot cross over into spirit, because it reaches the rarefied region of mental awareness. It is itself mind. How does it go further? And so it can stay there, and if by that time the psychic being has begun to come forward, it can make the rest of the journey. Or if it has not come forward and is only supporting from behind, there is an idealism and it reflects the higher consciousness, but is not able to make that real transition of the true mastery. So even without using the phrase of psychic being, in the very fact of the ascent being completed in the spiritual consciousness, there is something in you that goes beyond mind and therefore is not in itself mind. And that means it must be the psychic consciousness or some part of it that is sufficiently in the mind reflected, that is making that journey. In the way Sri Aurobindo formulates the framework of the integral yoga, he recommends that this link with the psychic influence should have become sufficiently strong, even if not the full emergence of the psychic, but it should have become sufficiently strong that that leads this movement of the rising of consciousness. Then the whole process can take place safely and securely. Otherwise, in this widening of consciousness, which he describes here, the consciousness including the universe in itself, there are three dangers. The first danger is an exaggeration of the ego. If it is your mind consciousness that is experiencing the wideness of the universe, it can claim itself, now I am as big as the universe. If by then the psychic influence has come forward, or even the psychic being is leading actively, then there is never that illusion. It is the divine consciousness which is embracing, of which I am a part. And yet it is me, in that sense. So this is the first error. And the second error which can come from the mind experiencing this is, he says, the sense of the cosmic illusion. Because remember the problem of mind which he discussed earlier? The mind finally is a part of nature. And so to the extent that it is experiencing the whole universe as itself, it has the sense that somehow the universe itself is illusory, because everything is just this mechanical movement, and there is behind it some kind of a silence against which this becomes unreal. Because mind itself is not the silence, and so the sense of illusion which comes. And there's a third danger which he speaks of, which is the danger of attack. Because as you open to the cosmic consciousness, you also can open to the cosmic ignorance, or the powers which represent in the cosmic working the opposition to the divine awakening. And they can also be working on a cosmic level, just as the evolutionary powers are cosmic. And there can be a collision, an attack. All three dangers are mitigated or entirely avoided by the emergence of the psychic being sufficiently before, so that first the ego exaggeration cannot take place because the psychic knows truly its right relation with the divine. Second, there is no cosmic illusion because the psychic being knows the world as an expression of the divine, knows the divine presence in all things. And the third, because it is pure, there is nothing in it that the attacking consciousness can touch. And so it is immune to attack. And that's why this emphasis before. But according to one's nature, he says, one can have an ascent and then an emergence of the psychic. But the sooner this comes forward, the safer and smoother the journey. We can close with this, and we continue after a month. I often, when reading passages like this, one often experiences a deep gratitude for what Sri Aurobindo has given as a gift, not only with such clarity for the satisfaction of the mind, but such fulfillment for the satisfaction of the heart. When you read this, yes, it is possible. Yes, this is what we want. This is what our life was meant to realize. That feeling, that deep satisfaction is also there. And in the midst of both of these satisfactions, some part of you feels the truth of it, and literally an imprint of the experience begins to dawn and becomes vivid. And if not for this, we would have been so lost, so confused by so many contradicting traditions and beliefs and convictions. And because they are true, because they represent a truth, they have a force, even a force of convincing you, yes, they are right. And then the other one says it, and yes, this is also right. How do you reconcile? And here is a larger truth in which you see these as special perspectives, special experiences. And anything which you look back, if you look back at the history of humanity, all those experiences, all those civilizations, all those religions, cultures, experiments even, they all served to build to this. And they all together in humanity point to this larger fulfillment which belongs to the whole of humanity and represents the next evolutionary step. Everything is included, nothing rejected. That's the beauty of this integral vision that Sri Aurobindo gives to us.
I want to tell something. 3 days ago in our radio, I read 1 hour and a half the text in French, about a letter when Aurobindo wrote to Paris. In April 1920, he describes the society. He's totally connected with Aurobindo.
Yes,
He's in Agenda
exactly. Yes.
1962. It's
Yes.
incredible.
Yes.
Incredible. I received some phone.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yes.
I read and read and read, and suddenly I understand the society of Aurobindo.
Yes. Yes.
He described also the past, present, and the future.
The term used is Deva Sangha, divine community. And there were many experiments in the past, and even when Sri Aurobindo was in Pondicherry, his brother was part of some such effort in Bengal. Of course, the spiritual foundation was not strong enough, and it is only when that foundation became strong enough that the mother began the work of Auroville. Until then, she was also preparing. So we are at an exceptional period in human history, where all of that which humanity has struggled for so long is here and ready for the fulfillment and the divine society. Tomorrow is the Darshan day. It's the anniversary of the day that Sri Aurobindo had the realization in the physical body of the Krishna consciousness, the overmental divine. He explains in one of his letters that in the historical manifestation that was Sri Krishna, the overmental Godhead had established itself in the mind and the vital, but not in the physical. But that is all that humanity could support at that point. And on the 24th of November 1926, in Sri Aurobindo, the same movement descended all the way into the physical body. And it was that which was preparing now for the descent of the supramental consciousness in the physical body. And that's why it is referred to by Sri Aurobindo as the day of the Siddhi. Because in the body consciousness, that divinity, that divine consciousness was established. So Sri Aurobindo not only has written these things from his experience, but he has embodied the experience in a way that imprints the experience in all of humanity, and especially those of us who enter in that relationship with Sri Aurobindo as our guru, as our spiritual leader, to whom our whole spiritual being consecrates itself entirely. We have the possibility to receive the experience that he had and to receive it imprinted in us even directly, to whatever extent we are able to, through the action of his Shakti, the Divine Mother. So I make these observations as a theme for preparation for tomorrow, for the occasion that it represents. As in any anniversary, there is a tendency for the consciousness that is established, especially for a spiritual anniversary, for the consciousness that was established to repeat itself and to establish itself more firmly in the physical consciousness. And so we can take a moment to meditate in gratitude and then close with the Om.